All right. We are so pleased to have Dr. Carol D. Lee this morning with us. She is the Edwina S. Terry Professor of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. She has developed a theory of cultural modeling that provides a framework for the design and enactment of curriculum that draws on forms of prior knowledge that traditionally underserved students bring to classrooms. Dr. Lee is active in the school reform movement in the Chicago Public Schools and has taught in both public and private schools before assuming a university career. She's the founder and former director of an African-centered independent school in Chicago that is 28 years old, the New Concept School. She is also a founder of a newly established African-centered charter school, the Betty Shabazz International Charter School. She is past president of the American Education Research Association. Currently, she is principal investigator on the Project Ready, reading for understanding across grades 6 through 12, evidence-based argumentation for disciplinary learning, funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences. Again, it is our great esteemed pleasure to have Dr. Lee. Please welcome her to the stage.
Well, good morning. It was an interesting literacy adventure following my map quest to figure out how to get here from the south suburbs. And I always, introductions are typically coming off the web page at Northwestern, and then I always remember that I have to update it because the independent school is actually 38 years old rather than 28 years old, and the charter schools that we have in Chicago, we have 3 campuses of the Betty Shabazz International Charter School, 2 elementary and 1 high school, and the network is 16 years old rather than newly established. So anyway, I had asked Michael when we were talking about this, about the breadth of the audience, and as I understand it, this is a total K to 12, and so part of what he had suggested that I do is to help you think about the connections between those of you, what you do for those of you who are working with younger children, those of you who are working with older students. I hopefully bring some interesting perspective in that over the 40-plus years that I've been engaged in this work in education. I've had the opportunity to teach both high school. I'm actually trained as a high school English teacher, but also worked in the city college system in Chicago, where he had, in many cases, older adults or adults who had had struggles, in high school, coming back to for their education, higher education. And then when we made the decision to form this African-centered school, which was actually in 1972, I had to learn how to teach young children, and I actually ended up teaching. It was interesting because we were all very, committed to doing this work and bringing culture in terms of working with these young African-American children. And we started on a Saturday program, but none of us were parents and none of us had worked with young children before. So we had this great set of activities planned that happened to involve using scissors, but we didn't know that 3- and 4-year-olds didn't know how to use scissors, and so that was the beginning of a pathway, really, of self-study, and ended up actually teaching 3rd grade for about 15 years. So hopefully I have a little bit of experience with some of the spaces I think that many of you are occupying. How many of you are teaching primary? Big primary crowd. How many of you middle school? And how many high school? Okay. The work that I'm going to talk about is partially influenced by work that we're doing in a project we're calling Project Ready, Reading Evidence and Argumentation and Disciplinary Instruction, funded by Institute of Education Sciences, includes partners from the University of Illinois Chicago, Northwestern colleagues here at Northern Illinois, West Ed, and Inquirium. So the Common Core introduces an interesting set of challenges. This is interesting. Someone showed me how I could make the screens on my computer bigger to see, and then but I haven't figured out how to get to do that. That's another literacy challenge, so I'm sort of be slightly looking here as I'm going on. But the Common Core essentially introduces a new set of very interesting challenges. One, it certainly calls for teachers to involve students in K-12 in basically just reading a lot more. There's a heavy focus on reading and content areas so that when you're looking at the standards for each grade level span, they will have sample examples of kinds of texts that they think would be appropriate in various disciplinary areas to include in the curriculum. There's a heavy increase on trying to expose young people to complex texts, and there's a lot of interesting discussion in the Common Core about what constitutes text complexity. I'm going to try to talk a bit about that. There's a heavy focus on argumentation, that is reading text in order to synthesize and glean information in order to take positions and to construct arguments, and we're going to try to address that in some detail today. Obviously, raising the whole ante relative to college readiness skills, and overall is sort of pushing back the kinds of complexities that sometimes we were anticipating working with older students are now being pushed back to focus on with in the younger grades. And assessments, as you know, are on the way. That's going to be a very interesting set of political issues about the states that are going to really use these tests or not use these tests, and whether they're going to use one test or multiple tests in states. Those of you who've been in the state of Illinois know, certainly I know from Chicago, I'm not sure about in other districts where there was one point, certainly in Chicago, where you had to take both. That was an Iowa test of basic skills. There was another test, the IGAP. So there were these two sets of assessments in elementary school, both of which bore very little relationship to one another. It was a very schizophrenic set of experiences, which in Chicago is not an unusual set of circumstances. I want to sort of push, there's a tendency, especially in the accountability movement in this country, and certainly in large urban districts, much of which involves pressures around accountability from the federal government, about looking at judging accountability on the basis of external assessments in reading. And it's the question of whether or not students are on grade level in terms of the outcomes on the assessments. And so, and there's also been a historical tendency in the teaching of reading and the kinds of curricular supports that are available to teachers for teaching reading to try to deconstruct reading down into a set of isolated skills. So you teach for the main idea, or then you teach for making inferences and the like, as though reading could be essentially decomposed in that way. But I'm going to argue that reading is fundamentally about an effort to make sense, and that it is a relational skill rather than an absolute skill. So everyone in this room are clearly expert readers, but at the same time, I could give each one of you a text with which you would wrestle. It might be some legal papers or insurance papers or medical papers, depending upon your background, and you might feel very much like your students who are struggling when you're trying to grapple with that text. And so the question about skill in reading has to do with the relationship between the range of repertoires or skill sets and dispositions that readers bring and the demands of text and the kinds of tasks that we're asking, in this case, young people to grapple with. So I'm arguing for what I'm calling an integrated model of reading that involves both prior knowledge, this is going to be interesting, prior knowledge of topics, an effort to make meaning, a variety of kinds of knowledge about language, including vocabulary and syntax. I didn't get to put on this PowerPoint a reference, but I'll give you the reference information. What I'm not going to do today, just because of time, is to try to demonstrate some differences in reading in, I'm going to concentrate on reading literature as an exemplar, but there, on the website for the Carnegie Foundation, for the Carnegie Foundation of New York, the adolescent, what was the Adolescent Literacy Council, there are a whole host of publications that are free to download, one of which is a report that I wrote on reading in the content areas, and it has extensive information about reading in mathematics, reading in science, reading in history. One of the arguments that I make in the work on, for example, reading both in history and in science, is the importance of syntax. That is essentially teaching the use of teaching grammar as a tool not just for writing, but for reading, so that when kids have text that involves sentences that are long and complex, it is precisely their understanding of the syntactical structures of English sentences that can allow them to deconstruct those sentences into smaller logical chunks in order to make sense of it. Obviously, comprehension strategies, metacognitive processes, and fluency. And my point is simply all these bidirectional arrows is to say that acts of reading involve moving back and forth between these skills and dispositions. And depending upon the demands of the text and the nature of the task and the skill set that the reader brings, some of these may surface as being more important or less important. The most powerful predictors of reading comprehension, obviously this you know well, have to do with fluency. The role of prior knowledge is often underestimated in terms of how we prepare kids for reading complex texts, and this is an issue that I'm going to try to illustrate in the talk today. But the more prior knowledge you have about the topic, the more you're able to compensate even if your skill set is low. Conversely, if you have a high skill set but low prior knowledge, then your skill set of strategies can help compensate for the lack of prior knowledge. And I'm emphasizing this notion of, and I'm going to talk about this in more depth as I proceed, but being able to analyze the prior knowledge demands of text that you assign, such that you can give kids then text that may be just a little bit above what they can handle on their own, that are going to pose challenges for them, but you're building the prior knowledge that the author assumes the reader is bringing before you ask kids to get to the text. So I've talked about this. Generic reading strategies, obviously monitoring comprehension. We do know from the literature that one of the things that characterizes struggling readers often, especially younger struggling readers, is that often they get socialized into thinking that saying the words means understanding, and as long as you can say the words, you don't have to make an effort to make sense because the name of the game is being able to say the words. And so this whole issue of how do you socialize young people into trying to monitor whether or not what they're reading makes sense, whether it makes sense to them, and when comprehension breaks down, what set of strategies have you made available to them to figure out what do I do when I get stuck, as opposed to internalizing getting stuck as a bad thing and an indication of lack of reading ability. Posing questions, drawing on what you know, making and testing predictions. And making and testing predictions is not an easy process at all, in large part because you're making predictions essentially from sentence to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph, from section to section. So it is a very constructive process to see whether or not the text fulfills the expectations that you've set up. And summarizing. So again, just summarizing what I've been talking about so far is the whole idea of reading as a relational skill rather than an absolute skill. And the overarching point, if there's any to take away from the discussion today, is the idea, which I'm going to try to address a little bit with Common Core, is that what changes from primary to middle school and high school is much less the nature of the strategies that you are teaching. What changes are the nature of the texts and the kinds of tasks that you're asking kids to engage with. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about in a minute is going to be about that. The nature of those tech syntax changes, and so we need to be able to teach both generic strategies, discipline-specific strategies, domain knowledge, which is often going to be very specific. I'm going to try to illustrate that in terms of literature. Now, in the Common Core, as I said, the Common Core is a huge step forward in many, many respects. However, there are some challenges. When they moved, initially, as you know, they put out the end of high school 12th grade Common Core standards, which was a small set of standards which were highly rigorous in terms of college readiness. But then they made the decision to try to go to grade level standards. And once they went to grade level standards, they did try to work in these bands. They actually ended up suffering from the same challenges that traditional grade level standards that every state has. That is, if you sit and look at those standards, I'm going to illustrate this in a minute in some high school standards for literature in the Common Core, is that they'll keep repeating the same verbs from one grade level to the next, and then they will add some little verbiage to make you think that the standard that they've set for the 5th grade is going to be fundamentally different from the one in the 3rd grade, or the one in the 8th grade is going to be fundamentally different from the 5th grade, when in reality they're not. They're all fundamentally the same. Part of the opportunities I think that Common Core provides is the focus on issues having to do with text complexity. They have a whole section in the Common Core where they're addressing the problem of text complexity. But again, there's still a bit of a problem because they're suggesting either one of two approaches. That you can either use quantitative measures. For example, you can go to the Lexile site, put in the name of a text, or even copy some portion of a text, put it in there in the website. It'll give you a Lexile level. Or you could take, or you can, sometimes they'll post readability formulas. You can take a piece of text, put it in Microsoft Word, and it will give you a Flesch-Kincaid grade level. So they're suggesting that you should be teaching texts that are more complex, and that if you get either the Lexile or the grade level equivalent on the text, that's going to give you good information. But they also recognize, because many of us, as they were evolving this, really began to push back on this question about how they were addressing text complexity. So they added another component that had to do with qualitative measures. But that is still pretty vague in terms of how, but I'm going to try to give you some illustrations of qualitatively how you can think about text complexity, particularly in this case with regard to literature. But the fact that at least they raised the question of deal with complex text as teachers think about what the demands of text are for novice readers is certainly a step forward. So this is an example of Common Core standards for 9th and 10th grade students versus the end of high school, 11th and 12th. And you will see, as I said before, that the language for key ideas and details and for craft and structure are exactly the same. And then they add on here, for example, for 11th and 12th grade, so it cites strong and thorough textual evidence to support analyses of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. Well, I think you'd want kids to do that in 1st grade, in 3rd grade, in 5th grade, in 7th grade. And then they add on, including determining where the text leaves matters uncertain. Now, why you would do that in 11th and 12th grade versus 9th or 10th grade or 7th or 8th grade or 5th or 6th grade, I don't know. I don't think there's any rational reason except that that we haven't moved to the point of trying to specify what is common about strategies that we're teaching across grade levels and highlighting and providing teachers with tools for dealing with the ways in which text and tax change. And the same holds true for craft and structure, that what they had this idea of including words with multiple meanings. Well, for heaven's sake, I do this with 1st graders, 5th graders, 9th graders. There's no logical or rational reason for the nature of those differences. So that's one of the challenges. So I'm saying Common Core is great, Common Core is here, but what I am going to suggest to you is that you want to look at Common Core as a critical document, and don't assume that it is, God's manna from heaven has now manifested itself in the Common Core, and all you have to do is sort of follow it as some sort of script, but to interrogate it in terms of where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense. These traditional measures, again, with readability formulas or lexiles, typically deal with the length of sentences, the length of the document, the level of vocabulary, etc. There's another tool out there called Cometrics. You can find Cometrics. You can look it up on the web. You're able at the Cometrics site to actually take text and put it in, and it will give you some Cometrics measures. The problem is it's really extraordinarily complicated, but they are working right now on trying to make it more user-friendly. And it can be very useful at one level with expository text. For example, it'll look at issues about how many ideas are there in text, to what extent are the logical relationships among ideas explicitly stated versus needing to be inferred. And those are very useful aspects of text complexity when you're dealing with expository text. But I would argue that both the readability formulas, the lexile levels, and the Cometrics, when it comes to literary text, really don't address sources of complexity and can be very confusing. So for example, in some of the work we've been doing in Project Ready, where most of the work that I do there is, again, is at high school in English classes, there's a short story called Damballa by John Edgar Wideman, which is a really complicated, really challenging story. And yet the scoring from readability formulas and lexiles don't really point to the sources of difficulty. And there is an error in there about the reading ease, because that reading ease of 81 is really not late high school, it's more like middle school. But the problem is that a mid-sixth grader, although they might be able to say the words, is going to have a really hard time trying to make sense of that story. And the reference to the use of concrete words in the story, in those formulas would suggest that the story is simpler, but the problem, again, when you come to literature, is that often simple words have very figurative and complex meanings that the simple literal translation of the word doesn't convey, and we don't have any measures really for capturing those levels of difficulty. So what I'm going to suggest here is another way of thinking about problems of text complexity, in this case in literary texts, that have to do with plot structures, the ways in which stories are organized in different ways, and depending upon how the story is organized, it leads us to expect different things from the story. So when you get ready to, and this stuff I think is interesting in part because it also applies to other kinds of narratives, for example, films. So when you get ready to go to the movie, if the trailer suggests that the movie is going to be a Western, then you expect to see certain kinds of characters, you expect certain kinds of actions to take place. Many years ago, the film, many of you may have seen, Legends of the Fall, Brad Pitt, and I forget who else was in it. And so when you first went to see the movie, it takes place in this Western thing, and Brad Pitt is the kind of macho-like, Western hero, which led me to expect certain things, but then he turned out to be this super sensitive kind of guy, and didn't fit the model of what I expected the Western hero to be. And at some point, because of my knowledge of different kinds of stories that are out there, at some point I realized that this was really a kind of an Odysseus kind of story, and that actually I predicted then that Brad Pitt was going to leave the ranch and go around the world to try to find himself. The point simply being that recognizing what kind of story and what kinds of stories are out there for kids is a strong piece of knowledge for beginning to anticipate what may be sources of complexities in literary texts. Different kinds of characters and character types, interpretive problems, things like symbolism, irony, and satire. Symbolism, irony, and satire can be found in children's books, as well as in the kind of literature that we teach in high school. Problems of point of view, trying to figure out who's talking, who's telling the story, whose point of view is being given. There's a story that we use in a project called The Jacket by Gary Soto. Some of you may have used that story before. And the boy in the story just goes on and on about how he hates this jacket. It's not the kind of cool jacket that he wanted his parents to buy him. And he begins to talk about how other people make fun of him, except we don't see the actual kids making fun of him. We hear him telling us that kids are making fun of him and how horrible his life is, having to go around wearing this ugly jacket, until at the very end of the story, he throws the jacket over the fence and then he goes and retrieves it. The story ultimately has to be understand the meaning or symbolism of the jacket in the story has to be understood in part by recognizing that the boy is an unreliable narrator, that you can't trust what he says about himself. If you believe what he says about himself, then you will have a totally different understanding of the story, and you will not be able to account for this one little detail. All the details throughout the story keep pointing to this notion that the boy hates the jacket, and this is the worst thing that ever happened to him. He's 11 or 12 years old. But if you don't account for the little twist that comes at the end of the story, where he throws it over the fence and then retrieves it, which then completely undermines everything that he's been saying. In terms of text complexity with expository text, conceptual density has to do with how many ideas are being communicated in the text. One way that you can do an informal assessment of conceptual density of an expository text that you assign is to outline it yourself. And when you create your own outline, you will have a list of all of the major ideas that are being communicated in the text. And the issues of conceptual density get complicated by the fact that this is something that the people at Co-Matrix point out. Sometimes expository texts will present and will be talking about a main idea. Sometimes they'll keep using the same target word to talk about that idea across paragraphs. Sometimes they will change the word that they're using to refer to the same idea. That increases the difficulty of the text. Sometimes when you do an outline of an expository text that you assign, and you begin to see the ways in which different ideas are being related to one another. Sometimes the ideas, you have a list of 5 different ideas or propositions being put in the text. Sometimes there'll be a cause-effect relationship between them. Sometimes there'll be a chronology of actions. Sometimes they'll be about posing a problem and giving a solution. Those logical relationships which you associate with text structure that you all certainly work with in your classrooms, sometimes those logical relationships are explicitly stated, so that there is, if there's a use of a word like because, then that's going to suggest a particular logical relationship between two or more ideas. But sometimes the logical relationship, the words that would convey logic, like because and if, are not there. And that makes the text more difficult. Visualization. In math, in history, and in science, there are often maps and figures, tables that convey information not in words, but in images. And there's a whole technology, if you will, to being able to teaching kids how to deconstruct the way various kinds of visualizations work, including the necessity of the task to help students infer the relationship between the visualization and what is written on the page. Sometimes the visualization will embody some propositions on the page. Sometimes the visualization will be in opposition to something that's on the page. Sometimes the visualization is just some new information and it's not directly connected to what's on the page. Vocabulary can be very complicated. We typically tend to think about sources of difficulty with relationship to vocabulary in terms of multisyllabic words, for example, or words that have Greek or Latin roots. But there are also vocabulary challenges, sometimes with very simple words like that. What is that referring back to? Which? What is which referring back to? Words that have to do, vocabulary that has to do with causal relationships like if and because and although are also really complicated targets for vocabulary instruction that I would argue is relevant from the primary grades all the way up through high school. I've talked a little bit about text structure. I also made mention of this issue of syntax, and that is the actual importance, and we don't do this a lot anymore. We don't teach grammar explicitly a lot today, and when we do, we typically teach it in relationship to writing, but rarely do we teach the syntax of sentences, English sentences, in terms of helping kids to read long, complex sentences. Kinds of routines that we would certainly want to socialize young people into in terms of close reading, I would say first and foremost is we have to structure our instruction in such a way that we are both modeling for but requiring that students engage individually in close reading of text, close examination of text, then in small groups so that they have an opportunity to share and learn from one another as part of this socialization process, and then to be able to create something that I'm going to call an external representation of what it is that they understand. If you don't get some external representation of what a kid understands, the meaning-making processes in which a kid is engaged as he's wrestling with the complex text, when you get to the end product and he, messes up, you have no idea why. Because in mathematics, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on showing how you work through a problem. We need a parallel to that kind of process in terms of reading comprehension, because reading comprehension is going on inside the mind, and as teachers, we've got to have some lens for helping kids to make external, not only what they understand, but how they've gone about trying to make sense of the text. In terms of expository text, this can be done through the use of annotations. Annotations either can involve, if you're using a textbook or anthology, for example, sort of printed text, you might make copies of just the first page of the text that you're assigning so that kids can actually write on it, or you can use little Post-it notes if you want to put it on the text itself, like when reading novels and the like. But where students are able to pose questions to the text, pose annotations about responses that they have, things that they feel, associations that they're making. And why? Because what that's doing is supporting kids into doing something that is external and physical that shows that I am thinking about the text and I'm not just a passive recipient of what I see on the page. I don't think I sent this one, but Reading for Understanding is a book put out by colleagues at West Ed, is a really excellent resource for all of these reading strategies across reading areas, and they have some really great rubrics, for example, for doing things like annotations. Detecting text structure, we need to give kids tools for what they might look for in terms of keywords. Those keywords may be at the beginning of a paragraph. In textbooks, they may be in section heads that would suggest what the structure of that text or that part of that text is going to be. That is, whether it's going to be a problem or solution or a sequence of activities, etc. But asking kids to make predictions, to test whether or not their predictions are holding up, monitoring while they're going on, as I said, creating these external representations of text through which the use of graphic organizers, I think, is an excellent resource for doing that. Now I want to shift into trying to delve into the demands of reading in disciplines using the exemplar of reading in literature. I want to suggest also, firstly, here that reading comprehension, and in this case we're talking about literature, but it really doesn't matter, is trying to understand kids' resistance, what kids do to push back when we're asking them to engage with complex and rich texts. Sometimes it's because, particularly I think when you get to the middle and high school, sometimes it's because they've had a history in school of thinking that the reading and writing that we're asking them to do is just procedural, doesn't have anything to do with anything meaningful. You're never going to do anything with it. It's something you do for teachers. If you're trying to make sense of a text, the name of the game is to figure out what's in the teacher's head so you can tell the teacher what it is he or she wants to hear. Under those circumstances, kids are less likely to become deeply engaged in the task. Sometimes the disidentification, I would argue, more often than not, has to do with kids feeling a sense of incompetence. That is, that we're asking them to do things that we haven't prepared them to do. And that may be because they don't have adequate vocabulary knowledge, syntactic knowledge, et cetera, or the text assumes prior knowledge that they don't have, et cetera. In the Project Ready, what we've tried to do is for each content area, and again, I'm going to illustrate it in literature, but we've done it in history and in science, reading in history and reading in science, is to define a framework that involves certain dimensions. One dimension has to do with epistemology, another with key concept, another with types of text. This focus on epistemology is important because the idea, for example, that is emerging in the reading of history to teach kids, even young kids, to read as a historian reads. Historians do not read, for example, primary source texts as sources of fact. They read primary source documents as hypotheses that people have made about events in the past. And there's a whole set of strategies that they have for trying to interrogate those texts. In literature, one of the powerful things I think about the teaching of literature is that literature, from my perspective and that of many others, is probably the most powerful domain in which we teach in schools that involve interrogating what it means to be a human being. And even with children's books, I remember the story I read. My daughter, who's now 38 years old, collects children's books. She loves children's books. There's a children's book I love called Grandma's Joy, that you can be deeply moved even as an adult about. I have a grandbaby. She's 2.5 years old, and from the time she was born, her mother has been reading her poems from Honey, I Love. And she asked for it. She's memorized. She can, just go through the poems, Honey, I Love, I Really Love, along with her mother. And that literature is not intended as about absolute rights or wrong. And literary texts are intended to be open and to be interrogated. And that in literature, what we value is not only a focus on the content, who are the people, what did they do, and what happened, but we also value, we also value attention to form. That is, the language that is used and how the text is structured. I had, in a course I was teaching for people preparing to become high school English teachers, some years ago, I ended up in an interesting conversation with a teacher who was talking about The Lion King. And what I argued to her was, the Lion King story is essentially very akin to Hamlet. And so what I argued with her was that if the point of reading Hamlet was to get the message, then look at The Lion King. Why wrestle through Shakespeare's language, right? The wrestling through Hamlet is in large part both about what you can take from this story about what it means to be human, but also the beauty of the language that he uses to convey. And if we don't teach kids to be appreciative of the way in which the language of literary text and the form of text are put together, then often we are not providing them with access to getting at what the deeper meanings that may be available. And I'm going to try to illustrate that as I go on. And interestingly enough, for those of you who are English teachers by training like myself, I would argue that the net outcome of teaching English at the high school is to socialize young people to hate the very literature that English teachers love. And that is to say, it is very unusual to find a high school graduate who then comes on here to Northern Illinois, who runs off to the bookstore and says, I've read Hamlet and I've got to read Henry IV. Where can I find it, in the Barnes & Noble section? And often those of us who are English teachers know that our friends think that we are weird and the things that we read are weird and they don't make any sense at all. But I would argue that's largely about the kind of epistemological orientation to literary text that we socialize in school. And I would argue that every point that I'm making on there about an epistemological orientation to what literature makes possible should be taught from the primary grades forward. It's not something you wait till they get to high school. Maybe, give them a little bit of it in middle school. It's a socialization that can entice kids into loving literature. Key concepts in literature have to do with moral and philosophical content, ideas about love and justice and courage, often historical context. I'm going to share a story with you near the end of this presentation where the literature subtly embodies a historical context. Traditions of critical theory, that is, you can read the text in ways that for example, the reading of, that's mine. Everybody's looking at their phones. The reading of the Scarlet Letter, that in many cases, the way we, particularly women, will read the Scarlet Letter in the 21st century is quite different than Hawthorne perhaps even intended. That is, that we can bring positionality that we have as readers in interrogating a text. And so we've talked about types of text and characters. Also, another important dimension we argue has to do with ways of using language, and this issue of ways of using language is really, really important in literary texts. So attention to things like imagery and figurations. Talked about problems of point of view, rhetorical strategies. This is really, really important. And again, I'm going to try to illustrate it with a very short, what appears on the surface to be a simple story in the latter part of this talk. But things like the choices that literary authors make to get our attention. And they do it in children's books as well as in canonical literature. And that would be things like parallelism or contrast or repetitions or understatements or exaggeration or allusion, right? In Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which I'll have some brief allusion to as I move through this, how many of you have read Beloved? So Beloved is this really magnificent, challenging novel about a woman named Seth, who was an African woman who had been enslaved. She tried to escape from slavery. Before she was trying to escape, she was pregnant, and the men who thought they owned her raped and beat her. She finally escapes, and the men who beat her come back to try to take her back into slavery. and in a point of absolute fear and terror, she slits the throat of her baby, because in that moment, death was a gift as opposed to being taken back into slavery. One of the characters is called Baby Suggs, who is her mother-in-law. And Baby Suggs talks about having had, I don't remember, 4 or 5 children, but she says the only thing that she could remember about them was that one of them liked burnt toast. That's an example of understatement that draws our attention, the idea that a mother would have had 4 or 5 children, and the only thing that she could remember about all of those children in the latter part of her life was that one of them liked burnt toast. It's extreme understatement, which is Toni Morrison says, pay attention, I'm trying to tell you something, right? The kinds of things that we're trying to do in making sense of literary text obviously involve understanding the sequence of actions in a story and how they're linked together. Sometimes in stories, the actions, and this again holds true, again, I'm going to keep pointing out that everything that I'm pointing out, at one level, it may sound like it's high school, but I'm saying it's true of great children's books as well as it is of adult canonical literature. So sometimes the plots in a story take place in a sequence. This happens, and this happens, and this happens. But sometimes there's flashbacks, and things happen one time, then they go back in another time, then they go into the future. That makes the text more complicated. Trying to understand what makes characters tick, right? So how many of you had to read or may have chosen to read Oedipus Rex? So the few of you who have, I mean, to figure out, like, how do you figure out Oedipus's internal state? What makes this dude tick? Why does he do the strange things that he does, right? It's challenging. Structural generalizations have to do with problems that we're asking the reader to explain why the author has made choices that he has or she has around language or how they put the text together. So ways of then being, I'm suggesting that these are tools that you could use, as we talked about with expository text, for assessing the complexity of literary texts that you're assigning, and that's whether they're children's literature or whether they're canonical literature that you might be teaching in high school. That is, what is the nature, what is the genre, and one of the reasons this issue of analyzing text complexity is important is, one, there's no place to go to find this. You can't go to Heinemann, or it's not out there, which means you have to do it. And if you're going to take on the challenge that the Common Core has called on, you're going to need to begin to put sets of text together for kids to read. In the case of literature, and it's the same would hold true for text in other domains, and I'm going to try to illustrate that a little bit as we proceed, it is your analysis as a teacher about the kinds of demands that an array, let's say you're going to design a unit and it might involve 10 stories or 7 stories and a couple of poems or something. You need to have tools for figuring out why would you put these pieces together. Often we think about that only in terms of theme, but you could have a bunch of stories that have a common theme, but they have very different kinds of problems as texts in terms of the complexity of those texts, and you need tools for trying to analyze that. So one would have to be to do with the genres. Another, obviously, having to do with themes, and with themes trying to wrestle with the question of the developmental appropriateness. So I want to share toward the end of this talk a story that's very short. It's called Flowers by Alice Walker, and it's a very interesting question to wrestle with. How would you figure out whether or not it was appropriate, developmentally appropriate for the students with whom you're working? Sometimes it's interesting to, particularly in, I think you can do this in middle school and again in high school, is to have an opportunity for young people to read a text in 6th grade and then read the same text again in 8th grade, or read a text in 9th grade and read the same text again in 12th grade, to help them wrestle with how their own social maturity may help them to understand that text in more complex ways than they did when they were younger. Trying to figure out what kinds of character types are in there. Character types might include, well, I have a slide on that. I'll come to that in a minute. But character types can also be thought of in terms of complexity, in terms of whether they are stable or whether they are changing, whether they have a single characteristic or dimension, or they're very nuanced. These, again, are sources of complexity in literary text. Problems of point of view, the issue of who's telling the story. Sometimes one person's telling the story. Sometimes several people are telling the story. We have a lot of emphasis on this thing we're talking about in terms of omniscient narrators, but there are also unreliable narrators, narrators who tell us stuff and you can't believe what they say, right? So Jonathan Swift's modest proposal, if you assume that the narrator believes what he said, namely that we can handle the drought and famine in Ireland, we got all these children, if we would eat them up, we wouldn't have a food problem, then you can potentially be very misreading of the text. But also understanding the reliability of a narrator often is also associated with how you understand the author. So, for example, had Hitler written a modest proposal, you might not view it as satire because you might believe that Hitler actually believed that problem, solution rather. Rhetorical tools having to do with this thing I'm going to call rules of notice, but I'll illustrate that in a moment. So this was just a kind of a generic thing we've used. We've actually been working on developing a kind of a digital file of stories and then analyzing what are sources of complexity so that we could pull up stories that have common sources of complexity. So length, syntax, theme, historical context, under characterization for things like the types of characters, the number of main characters, the function of minor characters. The relationship between major characters and minor characters can be an interesting source of complexity in stories. The complexity of the kinds of relationships in those stories. For example, in Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, where she's talking about this act of incest within a family against this young girl, but interestingly, the father who perpetrates the incest is not portrayed in the novel as a unidimensional, horrible person. And what she tries to do, which is one of the sources of complexity of that text, is to try to understand both the horror of what he did, but also to understand the vulnerability of his own humanity. That's a complex kind of issue of characterization. Peter Rabinowitz has written a book called Before Narrative, in which he talks about features of text. In other words, he argues that there's certain kinds of strategies that literary authors use that expert readers bring to the text before they ever open the page. And they have to do with things like privileged positions. So titles, particularly in stories and poems, matter. The point I was making about the story The Jacket, where all of the story is talking about how this boy hates the jacket, but it's at the ending, and endings are also a privileged position. That's where everything changes with the one line at the end of the story. Repetition, exaggeration, understatement, dense description, anomalies, figuration, parallelism, contrast, allusion. All of these are tools that literary authors of children's books and canonical literature use to get the reader's attention. To the extent that kids are not aware of these tools, if you will, that literary authors use, they're more likely than not to ignore them. So, for example, the Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison has, I think it's the second chapter that starts, "The nuns walked by quiet as lust." And we teach kids, when you see a reference to a character, that you look and try to find out, well, there's not another reference to nuns anywhere in the whole novel. So what do inexperienced readers do? They throw it away. Well, so forget, I'm looking for nuns, no more nuns, throw it away. But Toni Morrison is using the anomaly of nuns and lust at one point to draw your attention in. She really wants you to pay attention to that. He also talks about this notion of distinguishing between authorial and narrative audience. The authorial audience, the authorial audience is the audience that the author assumes he's talking to. So when kids are reading stories, for example, that were written sometime in the past, it is often that the author assumes certain social conventions, for example, that a modern reader might not know. That means that what the author assumes the reader knows is something that you have to prepare kids for. Okay, let's move on. So, in mapping out this domain of literature, I'm arguing that there are common themes which would be not certainly very familiar to you. This issue of interpretive problems, meaning there are spaces in stories where there's a disruption often of the literal that the author is inviting you to try to make sense of. That includes things like symbolism, irony, satire, etc. Kinds of stories, magical realism. So when you're reading magical realism and you see strange things happening, ghosts talking and moving, the author assumes that you will pretend that that's actually happening. Coming of age stories, science fiction, etc., and then types of characters that we expect. So this is just a sampling of ways in which stories can be organized. And so as you're thinking about how, for example, to put text sets together or to pose problems that you want kids to interrogate, this is sort of one way of thinking about the range of what text can invite. You can't see that, and I can't either, so we'll leave that. So, in preparing kids then to read complicated texts, we're going to prepare them based on your analysis of what are the kinds of things going on in this story that are going to make it difficult for the students that you have, and then you're going to prepare activities that build up that skill set before they get into the text. Now, in literature, there are two ways of thinking about this issue of building up prior knowledge, and then we kind of move quickly into some of this work on argumentation. George Hillocks talks about something that he calls gateway activities. And gateway activities are activities that are intended to help readers to develop criteria for making judgments. So you may have themes like a coming-of-age theme. And so, for example, in reading, Scott Finch, To Kill a Mockingbird, right? The question of asking students to make a judgment about whether Scout's father is a good parent depends on the criteria that the students are using for what makes a good parent. And so gateway activities would be kinds of activities that you would design before they start reading the story, which I'll try to illustrate that in a minute, some contrastive cases of good parenting, bad parenting, parenting that's somewhere in the middle, so that they come up with a set of criteria so that when they begin to read a story like To Kill a Mockingbird or Black Boy by Richard Wright, they have some criteria around which to make these judgments that they're arguing about. There are also then the need to build skill sets for dealing with these interpretive problems that I talked about. That is, recognizing when there's something in the text that is intended to be symbolic or satiric or ironic, and how do we help kids develop those strategies. Those strategies are challenging to understand and to use, and simply giving kids a definition of symbolism or a definition of satire is not sufficient for helping them to wrestle with those kinds of problems. That's where we introduce, in my own work, we call cultural data sets that are intended to teach skills, and I will show that in a minute. So gateway activities are ones in which you identify a target that has to do with an abstract idea like courageous action or coming of age. And you're going to generate exemplar cases of things that are obviously courageous and things that are obviously not courageous, and then scenarios in which it's kind of ambivalent because there may be different kinds of courageous action. So for example, all of this work comes from George Hillock's work, and this text at the bottom, Designing and Sequencing Pre-Writing Activities, should still be available from NCTE as part of their Theory into Practice series, where he'll give a case, for example, of a fireman. There's a fire, there's a house on fire, and the fireman comes and he goes into the house and saves the boy. Then he contrasts that with Joe Blow is walking down the street and the house is on fire, and Joe Blow goes in to save the child. And the question is, are both of these examples of courageous action, or are there criteria that distinguish the nature of the courage of the fireman who's trained to deal with this challenge versus the nature of the courage of Joe Blow, who is not trained? I'm gonna go to an exact example. So part of what the kind of work that I'm dealing with here around text complexity, I think, requires is a very careful analysis of the nature of the problems. So for example, it is not uncommon, either middle or high school, that we may attempt to address issues of helping kids recognize symbolism in text. But symbolism is a very complex, not only construct, but complex ways in which symbolism may present itself. It may serve different kinds of functions. It may manifest itself in terms of actions or the internal states of characters in stories, or settings themselves can be symbolic. And so just beginning to engage perhaps in even forming small communities within your building or some other professional network of really beginning to interrogate what's entailed in teaching these complex strategies. In my own work and what I'm calling cultural modeling, I'm arguing that these things like symbolism and satire are things that that kids engage in every day when they're not in school. And so we have used, in this case, rap as one example of a song. This is an old song. All the rap stuff I use is old because I don't listen to it, but a song by the Fugees. And the argument that we've made in working with kids is that the kids, at the time that it came out, who listen to this story, none of them think that the mask is a physical mask. None of the kids think that there's somebody at Burger King with a mask on. But what we're trying to do in the use of what we're calling these cultural data sets is to try to get kids to make explicit to themselves and one another, how do they know that this is not a literal mask? And they will say, because people at Burger King don't wear masks. Often, as kids are explaining how they know something is figurative, symbolic, satiric, or otherwise, they will use very local language, and then the teacher's job is to translate that local language into an abstract rule. Oh, you mean that if what you're looking at the story obviously could not happen in real life, it probably has a meaning that is greater than the literal. That translation into this strategy as an abstract proposition then becomes a tool that they can use when they get to other stories. Saying that the people at Burger King don't wear masks is nothing you can apply to another story, right? So this is an example of someone, of a youngster responding to the lines here. I used to work at Burger King, a king taking orders, punching my clock. Now I'm wanted by the manager, souping me up, saying you're a nice worker. How would you like a quarter raise? Move up the register, large in charge, but you gotta be my spy. Come back and tell me who's bagging my fries, getting high on company time. Hell no. Siree, wrong MC. Why should I be a spy when you spying me and you see what you thought you saw but never seen? You missed your last move. Checkmate, crown me king. And when I've given this with teachers, they struggle with it. And when I give it to kids, they're like off the chart. Just always interesting, right? All right, let's get the...
When he was fighting, when he beat him up, because in order for him to have his mask on, he was spying on that person.
Turn up the volume.
He was spying on somebody. But in order for him to realize that the man was spying on him, he had to take off his mask
No, it's probably...
in order to realize that the man was saying, I don't know.
I don't know that you could... Yeah. Interesting mic to put by the phone, right? There's another one I'm going to show, so I'll just try it with that. But basically what she does is to make an argument that the guy working at Burger King is a king, and he doesn't come into Burger King announcing that he's a king. So he wears a mask to hide who he really is from the people with whom he's working. And the manager is trying to get the guy to snitch on the other people, but he doesn't come in and say, I'm trying to use you for my own purpose. So the manager is wearing a mask. Then she argues that in order for the king who's wearing a mask to recognize that the manager is trying to use him, he has to remove his mask in order to... So this is a really complex argument, and it's exactly what we want kids to do with literary text. Other cultural data sets may include things like film. So this, I'm not going to show it, but it's a short film that was on, you can actually get this on YouTube now, but it used to be on something called Subway Stories. It's about 3 minutes long, and it's just ripe with all kinds of symbols. The heuristic that we've taught kids for once they recognize that a set of text is symbolic, that they identify the text where they see the what they think is potentially symbolic. They make real-world associations with that, and then they hypothesize what relationship might be between the associations they make and what they see in the text. I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to try to go through these in detail, but again, these are specific strategies for detecting satire and for making sense of satire, and the point is that these are strategies that can be taught. This is an example of a cultural data set on unreliable narration. So this is, who is this, Cobbs and Hobbes, where you see it all the time. So now let me go real quickly, try to finish up in the next 5 minutes at max. I know you're getting tired of me going on argumentation. So there are two kind of models around argumentation that they don't talk about in Common Core, but which I think would highly inform how you would think about teaching argumentation through Common Core. One is a model based on Stephen Toulmin that involves making claims. The claims become more sophisticated when there are qualifiers attached to them, providing evidence. Sometimes that evidence is generic. At other times in the disciplines, they will be very specific, and I'll try to illustrate that in a minute in literature. Providing warrants. Warrants and backing are the hardest things to teach kids. So it's likely in the early grades you might be focusing on claims and evidence, and then by the time you get in middle school, it's a good time to start thinking about warrants, because warrants are how you explain to someone why your evidence makes sense. And backing has to do with often an appeal to principles or beliefs or knowledge that supports the warrants. Counter arguments, most sophisticated arguments are ones in which students can anticipate what somebody might say against the argument that you've made, and how would you rebut that. And nested arguments are the most complex, because nested arguments involve making big claims, but there are a set of subclaims that you have to accept in order to accept the larger claim that's being made. Another dimension of argumentation, and you could go on the web, there's all kinds of stuff on Toulmin's, the structure of Toulmin's arguments. George Hillocks, and I think they ordered his book, Teaching Argument Writing, which is a really superior work on this, talks about different kinds of arguments. So beyond that structure, he says there are arguments of fact, where you're trying to figure out what is it that's going on, arguments of judgment, in which you're using criteria to make a determination about the viability of something, or arguments of policy. This is an example of what he would call a gateway activity around arguments of fact. And so it's a picture, there's this woman and this guy, he's at the bottom of the stairs, and we're told that she was at this club, and she left the club, and she came back, and he slipped down the stairs. And what they're trying to do is to have the kids to figure out what actually went on. That is, how would you determine what is going on? So things like, for example, the fact that he's laying down face up, but he was supposed to have fallen down the stairs. The fact that he's got some glass at the bottom in his hand, but the glass is not broken, but she says that he fell down the stairs. So the question is slip or trick. And he has a whole host of scenarios like this that are really deeply engaging of kids, that are teaching them how to assess the viability of fact in terms of arguments of judgment. These are examples of kinds of questions that we have posed around the literary text in the Ready work that have to do with interpreting symbols or interpreting problems of unreliable narration. The structural generalization questions are the ones that are hardest for kids, that they have the least amount of experience working with. This, again, is an example of a kind of argument that is very consistent with Common Core. And that is a question that asks the students how it is that the author has structured the text in order to convey a meaning that they've taken from. That's a very different kind of question and requires a very different kind of argumentation than a question that says, what do you think this text is about? Let's see. So let me skip that and just go to this. Also, we've also developed a rubric. So when we're asking kids to write these argumentative essays or persuasive essays, in this case about symbolism, then we have a rubric that we're using to evaluate those essays. The kids use those rubrics in terms of also being able to monitor their own progress. Let me go to this illustration and then close out. These are three stories that could be thought of as stories having to do with coming-of-age stories. They're typically taught in high school, but they could easily be taught in middle school. The grade level readings estimations go from the middle of 5th grade to the early part of 6th grade. And what I'm arguing is that sometimes these challenges that we have with kids who are struggling readers, for example, in the later grades, we assume that the point I'm trying to make with this is that there are literary texts which appear on the surface to be very simple in form, but are actually very complicated stories. And that using this, that if you have the appropriate preparation, you can have younger kids wrestle with stories that are simple in form by giving them the resources that I've talked about to deal with the complexity, Or conversely, you can work with kids who are older, who are struggling readers, giving them stories where they're saying the words is not the problem, but again, you're giving them tools and resources for being able to tackle what are going to be complex problems. One of the things that Common Core calls for is the reading of multiple texts, including expository texts. And I wanted to, except I'm running out of time, I wanted to show you this story of the flowers as a simple story to try to illustrate how some of these issues of parallelism and understatement play out in a real story. But it's about a little girl. The details in there figuring out that she's growing up at a time when there were sharecroppers, and she's going through this forest. She's able to play around on a lot, and then she ends up walking some distance from home and comes across a dismembered body, and she walks over it. And the inferences that we're supposed to make, we have prior knowledge, is that it's a result of a lynching. And we've used this story with high school kids and middle school kids who don't get the story because they don't know anything about lynching. So they don't even recognize that she's come across a body. And then we're told that there is this sort of wrapping around of this flower. So anyway, the flowers become symbolic in it. So I was thinking about sort of what kinds of text could you put with a story like that. In this case, this is a children's story going someplace special about this girl who's asking her grandmother, can she go out someplace that she normally hasn't been, and the grandmother's very reluctant, and then finally we find out the place that she gets on the bus, and then she has to go to the colored section. And I'm arguing that this could be an interesting complementary text. There might be very interesting ways of marrying canonical text and children's text in terms of access to exploring themes, along with reading in expository text, so that if you were using this story, which inferentially is about lynching, could also then connect that with expository text. This is a whole collection of primary source documents. So with that, I'm going to close. I had a few other things to show you, but we don't have time. A lot of this, especially around the literary stuff, is in my book, which I think is out there, Cultural Literacy and Learning. I think this is also out there. You get it, but anyway, it's from Heinemann with just extraordinary details about the teaching of argument. So I think with that, I will close out and open it up for any comments or discussions or feedback that you might have. What happened with it?
They appreciated the PowerPoint.
Oh. No problem. Yes. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it depends on the grade level. I think in primary, it's not only much easier, but it's actually more often used. I think middle and high school, it becomes more challenging. In fact, the reading of texts that are not textbooks in traditional science classrooms is a huge challenge, in part because science teachers have been socialized, as have history teachers, and math teachers for that matter, into thinking that they're teaching content and not reading, and so kids don't. There's a wonderful book, it's not exactly addressing your question, but there's a wonderful book by John Paulos, Paulos, called A Mathematician Reads the Newspaper. And he has examples of all kinds of articles in newspapers where claims are being made using mathematical data, except the mathematics is wrong, which would be quite interesting, for example, to use in those classes. I would also say that one of the opportunities, I also think, though, can involve the pushing the boundaries of what it means to know in these domains. So this epistemology is a dimension of what we're trying to teach that I was talking about. So there's some colleagues at Turk who've done some work. They work with science teachers, where teachers come up with things that happen in their classrooms that don't make any sense, and they come together as a professional community of teachers and begin to investigate it. One of the examples is there were these two Latino girls in a second grade classroom. They were teaching about the growth of plants. One girl was the child of professionals and was dominant in English. The other girl was a recent immigrant and poor and largely bilingual but Spanish dominant. The teacher asked them about the plant growth. The middle-class Latino girl talks about the growth of the plant on a graph, and the teacher said, yeah, I understand that. The other little girl says, well, when the plant grows, it's like how my feet feel when my shoes are too tight and my feet feel all crinkly. And the teacher's like, what is she talking about? So they brought this to this community of teachers. And again, this is what I'm really recommending. I'm really suggesting that the Common Core is just a starting point. It is not an end point. And the problems that it invites you to wrestle with are ones that you have to wrestle with in your own professional communities. You can't hide them in I went to IRA and the room was like twice this size, and every seller has got Common Core stamped on it. It's all, I shouldn't say that, it's a lot of hype in it to really get at the core of what it's about. And what they came up with was saying that what this young lady, this child was doing was imagining herself inside the phenomena of growth. Not growth as a linear process, but growth as an unfolding process from the inside out. And then they went on to say, the study that said that in the history of science, this as a disposition was one that scientists actually use when they're examining phenomena that they don't yet know about. And the example they give is Einstein, who's on the tram. He's thinking about all this stuff about relativity, and he's looking up and sees the clock, and he's moving, and he begins to use his imagination, right? So that the possibility then in science classes of reading stories about human beings using their imagination to try to understand some phenomena could be an example of the kind of connection that you're talking about, but it would require that science teachers begin to think beyond the bounds, you know, in some sense of how they've been trained. Yes?
How do you feel about the argument versus using focus on the classics with Dante, the Odyssey, as opposed to reading more modern works that students might find more relevant?
Well, for me, this goes back to the point, that first point I was making when we talk about this ready framework around epistemology, right? If the point of the English curriculum, let's say at the high school, is simply some exposure to these assumptions about what constitutes a canon, which is an assumption, right? Give them spark notes. You know, get a whole, you can spark notes for Dante, the Odyssey, all of them, and they'll know them. There is so much literature in the world. Canonical simply means that literature has stayed the test of time, and you will then find canonical traditions in every country all over the world. A couple of years ago, I was in New Zealand, and they had a book exhibit, and it was all of this fiction written by authors from New Zealand, particularly indigenous authors, Maori authors. I didn't know anything about this literature. So if the point epistemologically is to open up kids to the ways in which literature invites introspection, that's the point, right? And the only reason for interrogating what we would think about as canonical, however we define it, is I argue that writers who have stayed the test of time, I think, are like priests with the gift of second sight. They're able to see into the human experiences what we mortals often don't see, and they give us an opportunity. And if that's your starting point, then you're trying to figure out how do you make connections between kids and the huge array of wonderful literary texts that are available. But that's very different than saying it's know these things. If that's it, as I said, Spark Notes is a much more efficient way of doing it.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I really like how you explained all of the things to look at, like all the different rhetoric and literary things that
Mm.
text kids to look for.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a resource, like we had the argument writing is a good one?
Mm-hmm.
Besides, what have you probably, another good resource for that, explaining that to kids and understanding that?
I would say two things. For high school, my books. But there are interesting pieces out there, some of which you can find on the web, for example, about teaching symbolism in children's literature. There was something I found just last night. Some professor, I forget the university in Arkansas or someplace, was teaching his English major students to detect symbolism in children's books. So there are actually a lot for that. The other source, I would argue, there are 2 points I guess I would make. I try to summarize a lot of that at one level in the book. But literary criticism, so for example, if you issues of irony, Wayne Booth's Rhetoric of Irony, Point of View, Wayne Booth's Rhetoric of Fiction, there are canonical pieces out there about dealing with these kinds of technical problems in the world of literary criticism, which you can go to directly in terms of inferring some of these kinds of strategies, but then taking them and applying that to the literature that you're teaching. And I'm really reaching out to those of you who are teaching in the primary grades to say that you can engage very young children in dealing with these very same problems in great Caldecott winner children's literature, that these are not problems that have to await. So you might be reading Booth on irony or unreliable narration, but applying it yourself to the literature that you're actually teaching children. Also, on the unreliable narrator, there's another great book out of that NCTE series, Understanding Unreliable Narrators, and he's got great activities in here about teaching problems of narration, unreliable narration.